To this day, historians use this valuable source as a starting point for much of the research that they do about us, about our history, about our culture. But this resource is slowly disappearing. We're going to be talking about this over the next half hour on this week's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which as always is brought to you by...
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Linden Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report. With us today is Allison Frisch. She is both a former practitioner, reporter, news person, journalist, as well as now an academic. Allison, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you actually got into the field of journalism initially, and then what ended up bringing you to where you are now.
Thanks, Chris. On the program today. Yeah, I was a reporter and an editor in local news in Ontario County and Monroe County. I worked for the Ewing family and the Messenger Post newspapers for about 15 years. And then I went to Pennsylvania and was an editor at a paper there. And then I went back to school. I went to RIT. To study business management and get my graduate degree because the newspapers I was working for, unfortunately, were disrupted by the internet. The business models were disrupted. Companies were buying the family newspapers. And I really wanted to figure out how to save our local news. It's a big undertaking, but so I got that degree and then I started to teach part-time at first and then was offered a tenure track position at Ithaca College. And I thought about that for a while because I so enjoyed reporting in community news, but I thought perhaps I could help a new generation of journalists figure out how to preserve local news, really.
Before we get into what you're doing now, because that's really interesting too, I wanted you to kind of recap or refocus on exactly how you got into the news business to begin with, because you told me you had a unique, well, maybe it's not too unique, maybe it's fairly typical, but tell us exactly how you got your first job, so to speak, as a reporter.
Yeah, so I was a stay-at-home mom with my 3 children. We're all well grown up by now. In the early 2000s, actually mid-90s, early 2000s. And when our youngest child went to school full time, I called the local newspaper and asked if they had any part-time positions for a correspondent or a stringer, and they did. And so I went to things like the South Bristol Town Board meeting and the Farmington Town Board meeting, and I really enjoyed reporting on what our communities were doing. So I filled in all over Ontario County and eventually became the Victor Farmington reporter full-time, then the Canandaigua City reporter, and then went up through the ranks as an editor. But I started out as a stay-at-home mom who wanted to know more about what was happening in my community, and I enjoyed writing. So it all kind of came together that way, and then I got the schooling while I was on the job, getting the on-the-job training.
So you said you enjoyed writing, and that's actually anticipating what I was going to ask next is, how did you know you could write? Because when I talk to a lot of people, especially about submitting things to the newspaper, one of the obstacles that I see is people just don't have confidence in their ability to write. So what gave you that confidence? Were you an English major in college or something like that? But how did you have this certainty that you'd be able to produce the kind of reporting that or writing that newspapers would want?
You know, I didn't know for sure, but I always enjoyed English. I always read a lot when I was young. I was always reading books, and I loved my local hometown newspaper, which was the Daily Messenger, because I grew up in Bloomfield in Ontario County. So I enjoyed reading the paper. I was kind of a student of it, and I always tell my students this story that the first story I reported when I came back home to write it and send it into the newsroom, I think at that time I was delivering a hard copy over to the newsroom. Um, I wanted my story to be on the front page at the top above the fold. So I looked at a recent story that was on the top page above the fold, and I saw that there was a structure to it, which now I teach my students is the inverted pyramid. Um, but I didn't know technically what it was, but I saw how there was a lead. I saw how someone was quoted pretty high up. I saw the kind of news hook for the story, which is a nut graph. Again, I didn't know the technical terms, but I looked at the template of that story and tried to organize everything that I'd reported, all the notes I'd taken in that structure. And for me, the nonfiction writing for newspapers does have that structure, and I enjoy writing in that way and always enjoyed interviewing people because they were conversations. And so I would save all the quotes that I thought were really good, and the more I got to know the workings of the community and local government, the better I got at kind of working out that template. And it was a learning process.
I'm wondering how were you still reporting when we had this transition from handing in the pieces of paper to the editors or the and then where we are now where everything's by email, even the interviews a lot of times are by email. Were you involved in that transition, or could you at least speak to what you know about that transition, how reporting has maybe evolved over even the last 10 or 20 years?
I was. I really had a steep learning curve because when I started, I was delivering the hard copy either in a drop off box. One time I kind of snuck in through the where the press was, where they actually there was a conveyor belt that sent the papers out at the back of the building because I had to get my story in for the Sunday editor, and all the doors were locked and I couldn't even get to the drop-in box. And then when I started full time, they were just beginning to use email. Um, and I remember my editor telling me, check your email in the morning and then at the end of the day, but don't get distracted by your email. You have a lot of other things to do in reporting and writing. So, yeah, I was there for that transition and the transition to putting our news on a website, and then the transition to even using social media, which uh, is a big, big change.
So speaking of transitions, eventually you landed as an academic. And how did you go from being a practitioner to actually being a teacher? What door opened that allowed you to do that?
I think uh, I looked for opportunities, kind of like I got into journalism. I looked for opportunities for part time work to see if I would be a good fit with the students and for the students, and they for me. And I never, after raising teenagers, I never would have thought that spending day in and day out working with young people, young adults, that would be a good fit for me. And I can't tell you how inspiring that is for me. So I worked part time and I took to the students and they to me. And I'm really passionate about local journalism. And when I receive feedback from my students, one of the things that they really appreciate is my passion for local journalism. And I'm afraid that it's going away in the way we've known it in a lot of places. What you're doing with the Sentinel is amazing, and that's exactly what we need in our communities. But too many communities don't have that kind of coverage and aren't having these kinds of conversations. And interestingly, although the students are on social media a lot and um, grew up in they don't know anything other than the internet and email, they are really interested in community building and telling the stories of their communities. So I tried it out part-time and it was just such a good fit. And I felt like at this time in my career, perhaps I could contribute to not only the careers of young journalists, but to community building by rebuilding community journalism.
You mentioned that the students are interested in building communities. One of the experiences that I have working with both high school and college interns is initially less so with the college, actually, because they're given an assignment, a specific assignment, but with high schoolers who are interested in journalism, we often invite them to write something for the paper. And we like, you could appreciate this from an editor's standpoint. You'd like to get the point of view from, say, a teenager on some things that are happening either at the school or within the community. So it's a different side, a different flavor of what you're getting. Most of the submissions we get, however, are on national issues, not local issues. Do you see that a little bit, at least maybe in your incoming freshmen or the younger students that you have? And how do you get them to move away from the national issue, which is definitely more exciting, to the local side, which in ways sometimes is more important?
Sometimes, I try to appeal to the fact that many of them don't like the cable news style of people yelling and pundits and op- opinionating and kind of fighting over politics. I think they hear it in their homes a bit, and they actually they don't think that's a good fit for them. However, they do spend time on social media where um, there isn't, everything local is national. And when we used to do local journalism, we would try to localize a national topic. But now there's no one really having those local conversations. Well, not no one, obviously, but fewer are having those local conversations. So, it doesn't occur to them that community building, storytelling, um, helping to make a community better by talking about challenging issues starts at home. So I even go one step further and say, imagine you went back to your home community because they know you there, and you would perhaps be able to gain some trust there, and starting to tell the stories of what's going on at school or what's going on in healthcare or what environmental initiatives your community is looking at and perhaps funding. There are topics that are of interest to them, like the environment, and I offer them a new perspective. If you live in a community, the environment there is likely very important to community leaders. And all politics are local. And if you start there, you can help facilitate that conversation that can lead to positive change for your community. And that message often resonates with students, believe it or not.
That's a good point. In fact, I would almost go a step further, is that there's local politics that kind of build up to the state level, maybe to some extent the federal level, but at least within the coverage area of the greater Western New York region, there are issues that, quite frankly, don't receive the coverage. These people who live there, the residents who live there, really don't have their voices heard. And it would be great if students could come back to their communities, talk to the people that live there for a long time, and almost act as a megaphone. Just think of the opportunity that that represents to the students, and really it allows them to build confidence in their own reporting skills as they move forward. We're going to take a break right now, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Allison about some of the projects that she's involved with. We'll be back in a moment.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken, but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back. You're watching the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Grossa, and this week's guest is Allison Frisch. She is a journalist academic at the Park School at Ithaca College, an assistant professor. Allison, we had a question come in, and it's actually a good question, something that we talked about earlier, not on the show, but before the show. And that is, the question is kind of blunt, is what's the use? Are there any journalism jobs left? And this is something that we're seeing in the industry, especially in major metropolitan newspapers where they're cutting back. We just had news from Gannett that they're cutting back, not so much the reporting. I think that's almost cut to a bare bone right now, but they're printing. They're moving it out of the Western New York region and somewhere in New Jersey. But in terms of reporting, is there a new model in terms of employment that you see perhaps emerging? And when I say new, it's not really new, because it's sort of the model that you yourself participated in. And that is, and I'm thinking primarily from community newspapers, this is what we see in a lot of the reporters we have. It's a hybrid model where you're working either part-time or freelance and have another job or some other means of income that can supplement what you're doing, but at least you're able to kind of meet your objective of being a reporter. Do you see this? Is that something that students are interested in or aware of, or are they just depressed because they don't think there's any jobs out there?
Yeah, Chris, that is a great question, and it's part of what I'm trying to think about as a researcher as well as a professor. And there are, there are some internet startups, and there's kind of pockets of activity where people are trying to do something new. but the viewer is absolutely right, and students' families ask them that too, especially if they're going to get a journalism degree, because a degree costs a lot of money, and how are they going to recoup that investment in a living wage? Um, and so there is research being done on this. There are some projects that have potential. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about my project, but one thing that I really advocate is having students and student newspapers help cover their region, and finding funding to help pay for that. And as a taxpayer myself, I know that we have to really judiciously look at how we fund projects like community journalism. I will say, I think public media can be a part of the answer here, um, because in for example, in the city of Rochester, we have WXXI, which has, the city newspaper now. It's connected to the Little Theater, and also the local WXXI programming. And I think that perhaps in funding for uh, public broadcasting, there may be some opportunities. Also for student startups, um, and local news startups. I think one thing that's starting to happen is that legislators in certain states anyway, and on a national level, are starting to see that journalism is vital to our democracy, and that is having conversations, shedding sunshine on what our government is doing and how it's spending our money, and being a watchdog on behalf of citizens. And so, in my work, I would like to continue to kind of bang the drum for that realization that journalism is important for our democracy. Um, if we aren't printing as many print newspapers, okay, maybe we print fewer, but we get information out there in a number of ways. Not all have to do with the internet. Maybe with community events. A paper like the Vermont Digger does that very well, and did during COVID for health information. So the Texas Tribune does a lot of political reporting. These are some nonprofit models. Um, so nonprofit, public media, and funding for public good uh, news organizations. I know Ken Doctor is a person who has been an industry watchdog for years, and he started something called Lookout Local, and it's not a nonprofit. It's actually a for public good, for profit local news outlet that I think is looking to kind of franchise in communities. Because the problem is, when we regionalize, we lose our local flavor sometimes. We're not seeing news that pertains to us, but maybe another county. And so putting together kind of a cocktail, if you will, of different funding mechanisms, different news gathering mechanisms, and different dissemination opportunities, from quarterly print to live events to a website or social media page. It's kind of putting together the right combination for each community based on its demographics and its needs. And that's a pretty big undertaking, but there are people working on it, and I'm happy to be working on it too.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've done my own research, obviously, from a business standpoint as a publisher of a newspaper, to look at these different alternatives. But as you were talking, it struck me that focusing on the student, focusing on the reporter or the news gatherer, these different business models aren't necessarily just to be viewed as a way to get a job, but possibly as a way to start a business. From an entrepreneurial standpoint, you see lots of people all over the internet starting up blogs that may or may not be newsworthy. But if you have the proper sort of understanding on how to report the news so that you have verification of what you're saying, second sources, that sort of thing, really journalism 101, you could produce probably a cleaner product. Now, having said that, I'm still partial to newspapers, and it's not just because I'm involved in the newspaper business, but as I mentioned at the opening, from a historian standpoint, the printed newspaper is the first take of history, and that doesn't change. Things that are on the internet can disappear. And I know that if you digitize the newspapers, those digital copies could disappear too. But as long as you have that source document, you can rescan them and redigitize them at some point in the future if we have a solar flare and everything goes kaflooey. But anyways, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this because I want you to have a chance to talk about the projects that you're working on. Tell us a little bit about those and what you hope to achieve with them.
So, yeah, I mean, I think overall what I would say is I would like to combine some research with a resource center for early career journalists and community news that does a couple of things. The research, I would hope, would bring funding into communities, local newspapers, local news organizations, for robust journalism to help provide news organizations with local journalists. And that's a study I'm working on right now across Western New York, and we're hoping to get the whole state to see how many local journalists we actually have, and then see if we can interest our student journalists in going home to match them with their home community, or ideally their home community, and then get them the funding to do that work in their community for a local news organization if there is one. And what I would like to do at Ithaca College, and hopefully it would be a model for other colleges, is create a resource center for those local journalists if they ever need to come back and have refreshers, or if they need legal services, anything that they might need to make their jobs easier. I would love to have us provide in a resource center. At colleges, many of us experience having our alma mater get in touch with us and ask for a little donation, and that's all well and good, but I would love to also be there for students to call us and ask us for ongoing support for their journalism work. So for me, it's really a research and resource center that provides the research that might be able to argue in front of state and state legislatures and on a national level for funding for community journalism for organizations such as yours and for the young journalists. Also, that puts our student journalists in community news as well. And of course, we're in Tompkins County, but I think it could be a model for other colleges as well. So really that research and resource piece, and every year I do at least a piece of research. The most recent was Strengthening Community News, funding the teaching hospital model, which is journalists learn on the job in the region of their college, and local college and community collaboration. So providing the ongoing funding for those journalists in community news, I think could be a win-win for community news and for early career journalists.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think you're spot on. And there's a lot of ways really to just catapult ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I mean the student reporters, into an environment where they could really to begin to realize what they want to do. I mean, again, focusing on the local community, in my mind, I still think a lot of students probably have Woodward and Bernstein in their sights as the ideal, and you can make a bigger difference, in my mind, in your own local community. But again, I'm a little biased. So, Allison, thanks for being a part of today's show, and thank the audience for being here. And if you want to be a member of the live audience, which is the only way you'll be able to ask questions to our guests, then go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. You can sign up for the free invitations. Once you sign up every Thursday morning, you'll get an invitation to the live studio where you can watch and participate, ask your questions. If you work for a living and you can't do this during the day because it's every Thursday at noon, then you can always watch the show in our archives on our website, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, or if you like us on Facebook or subscribe to us on YouTube, every Sunday at 12:30, we rebroadcast, and the advantage of those two things, if you like or subscribe, you will be automatically notified when the show is airing. So again, Allison, thank you for being part of today's show. Thank you all in the audience, and we'll see everybody next week on the State of Greater Western New York Report.